You know what's strange about Generation X? They somehow became the richest invisible generation in modern history. Everybody talks about boomers and their pensions. Everybody debates millennials and student loans. Gen Z turns every financial struggle into viral content. But Gen X quietly built wealth in the background while acting like economic collapse could happen tomorrow morning. And if you look closely, their money behavior makes almost no sense until you understand what they lived through. This is the generation that saves aggressively but never feels safe. The generation that distrusts corporations but keeps investing in the stock market anyway. The generation that learned how to survive financially without ever believing the system would protect them. They are cautious and impulsive at the same time. They will refinance a mortgage 3 times to save a few $100s, then spend thousands on a concert reunion tour without hesitation. They are financially disciplined, emotionally skeptical, and permanently prepared for disaster. And none of that happened by accident. Because Generation X grew up during one of the most confusing economic transitions in history. They were raised by parents who believed stability was permanent, then entered adulthood just as stability started disappearing. They were taught that loyalty would be rewarded, that working hard would create security, and that institutions could be trusted. Then they watched layoffs destroy entire careers, pensions evaporate, housing markets collapse, and retirement plans turn into question marks. That contradiction shaped every financial instinct they have today. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Imagine being a child in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Your parents still believe in the old system. One stable job, one employer for decades, a pension waiting at retirement, predictable promotions, a house that steadily gains value, a future that feels understandable. You hear adults talk about retirement like it's guaranteed. You watch your father work at the same company year after year. You see neighbors buying homes without fearing financial ruin. The economy may not be perfect, but the rules feel stable enough that people can build their lives around them. Now, fast forward 20 years, you are suddenly entering adulthood in a completely different America. Companies are downsizing, manufacturing jobs are disappearing, entire industries are being outsourced. Loyalty is no longer rewarded because corporations themselves are no longer loyal. The people who follow the rules are getting laid off anyway. The adults who once looked financially secure suddenly seem terrified. Generation X became the bridge generation between economic certainty and economic instability. And psychologically, that created something unique. Boomers often believed systems would eventually work out. Millennials grew up expecting instability from the beginning. But Gen X experienced both realities at the same time. They remember stability clearly enough to miss it, but they entered adulthood late enough to realize it was already dying. That creates a very specific kind of financial mindset. You never fully trust success because you watch successful people lose everything. One of the strangest things about Generation X is how anxious they remain financially, even when they are objectively doing well. Many Gen X households earn strong incomes, many own homes, many have retirement accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet emotionally, they still behave like financial disaster is waiting around the corner. That anxiety is not irrational. It comes from repeated economic shocks during the exact years when adults normally develop confidence in the future. Think about the timeline they experience: the savings and loan crisis, the dot-com crash, corporate layoffs in the 1990s, the 2008 financial collapse, rising healthcare costs, pension declines, housing crashes, retirement uncertainty. Every decade brought another reminder that systems fail faster than people expect. So Generation X developed financial habits based on preparation rather than optimism. They build emergency funds obsessively because they assume instability is normal. They keep extra savings accounts because relying on one source feels dangerous. They over-prepare financially because under-preparing feels psychologically unbearable. This is why Gen X often appears contradictory to younger generations. Millennials sometimes spend emotionally because they assume home ownership or retirement may never happen anyway. Gen X does the opposite. They save emotionally because they believe disaster absolutely can happen. Their saving is not driven by excitement about wealth, it is driven by fear of vulnerability. And honestly, that fear has been rewarded often enough that they stop seeing it as fear at all. To them, it simply feels realistic. Generation X mastered something long before the internet turned it into a trend. Multiple income streams. Today, people call it side hustles, passive income, creator businesses, or diversification. But Gen X internalized this mindset decades earlier, and not because it sounded exciting. They learned it because they watched careers disappear overnight. This generation saw parents and coworkers dedicate decades to companies that replaced them in weeks. They watched middle managers lose jobs after 20 years of loyalty. They saw entire departments eliminated during restructuring while executives talked about efficiency. That changes how your brain views employment forever. A Gen Xer does not see one job as security. They see one job as exposure, so they quietly build backup systems. The consulting gig, the rental property, the eBay store, the accounting work on weekends, the small business nobody talks about at family dinners, the freelance clients they keep just in case. What makes Gen X different is that they usually do not romanticize entrepreneurship the way younger generations sometimes do. They are not trying to escape work entirely. They are trying to reduce dependence. That is an enormous psychological difference. Many younger people chase freedom. Gen X often chases resilience. Freedom feels uncertain. Resilience feels safer. And once you understand that distinction, their entire financial behavior starts making sense. One of the defining characteristics of Gen X money psychology is selective trust. They distrust corporations, governments, financial institutions, and large systems far more than previous generations. But interestingly, they often trust individual people deeply once relationships are established. That is why many Gen X consumers stay loyal to small businesses, familiar brands, or long-term service providers even while changing employers repeatedly. They may leave a company without emotional attachment, but they will stay loyal to the mechanic who has treated them fairly for 15 years. They may distrust Wall Street while trusting the same local banker forever. They may criticize corporations constantly while buying the same brands they loved in high school. Because in their minds, institutions break promises. People sometimes keep them. This is also why Gen X became highly skeptical consumers. They grew up during the rise of aggressive advertising, financial scandals, corporate mergers, and endless marketing manipulation. Over time, they learned to filter almost everything through skepticism. If a product sounds too good to be true, they assume it probably is. If a company suddenly changes policies, they prepare for hidden consequences. If an investment opportunity feels overly exciting, they immediately look for risk. This generation rarely approaches money with blind optimism. They approach it with cautious investigation. And ironically, that skepticism protected many of them from financial disasters that trapped other generations. Here is where Generation X becomes psychologically fascinating. Despite their financial caution, they spend heavily on experiences, concerts, travel, vacations, reunion tours, weekend trips, bucket list events, live entertainment, family memories, and they often spend on these things without guilt. Why? Because Gen X learned something emotionally important long before social media turned it into motivational content. Possessions are unstable. This generation watched how housing values collapse. They watched expensive cars lose value instantly. They saw luxury purchases become financial burdens. They learned that material status could disappear surprisingly fast. But experiences felt different. Nobody can repossess a memory. Nobody can crash the value of a concert you already attended. Nobody can lay off your family vacation. So Gen X slowly shifted emotional value away from ownership and toward experience. This is not the same as the minimalist culture younger generations often promote. Gen X is not necessarily rejecting material things philosophically. They simply stopped believing material things create emotional safety. And because they spent so much of adulthood preparing for uncertainty, experiences became one of the few categories of spending that actually felt emotionally worth it. That is why many Gen X adults will appear extremely practical in daily life while still spending thousands on travel or live events. To younger generations, it can look inconsistent. To Gen X, it feels completely logical. Experiences survive economic downturns better than status symbols do. Generation X treats debt very differently from both boomers and millennials. They are often comfortable with structured debt, but deeply uncomfortable with chaotic debt. A mortgage makes sense to them because it feels measurable. A business loan can feel acceptable because there is a strategy behind it. Debt attached to an appreciating asset feels psychologically controllable. But revolving credit card debt creates intense discomfort. Because Gen X witnessed what uncontrolled consumer debt did to households during the 1980s and 1990s. They watched families slowly drown in minimum payments. They saw financial stress destroy marriages. They watched adults normalize debt that never actually disappeared. that experience created an internal distinction between planned debt and dangerous debt. Planned debt has an endpoint. Dangerous debt expands quietly. So, while younger generations sometimes normalize carrying balances due to rising costs of living, Gen X often experiences even moderate consumer debt as emotionally threatening. Not because they are financially ignorant, because they have seen what prolonged debt stress does to people psychologically over time. And unlike boomers, they no longer assume long-term stability will automatically save them eventually. Perhaps the most important thing about Generation X money psychology is this. They fundamentally believe they are responsible for figuring everything out themselves. This generation grew up before constant internet guidance existed, before algorithmic recommendations, before financial influencers, before every decision came with endless online opinions. If they wanted answers, they researched, they read books, they learned independently, they experimented cautiously, they taught themselves systems. That mentality never disappeared. So even today, many Gen X adults prefer self-directed financial management. They read investing articles themselves, they compare insurance policies themselves, they build spreadsheets, they monitor retirement accounts personally, not because they think experts are useless, because they do not fully trust anyone else to care about their future as much as they do. That mentality can create stress because self-reliance is exhausting, but it also created a generation that became highly adaptable financially. When systems changed, they adapted. When industries shifted, they learned new skills. They rebuilt. That adaptability may actually be the defining feature of Generation X. Not optimism, not ambition, adaptation. Generation X is financially different because they were psychologically shaped by broken expectations. They were raised to believe stability was normal, then spent adulthood discovering stability was temporary. They learned to work hard before they learned that hard work alone was no longer enough. They entered the modern economy early enough to remember the old system and late enough to suffer through the collapse of it. So now they move through money with permanent caution. They save aggressively because security feels fragile. They diversify income because loyalty feels dangerous. They distrust institutions because institutions repeatedly disappointed them. They spend on experiences because experiences feel more permanent than possessions. They prepare constantly because uncertainty became their baseline definition of adulthood. And perhaps the most important thing about Gen X is that they rarely complain about any of this publicly. They simply adapted quietly, which may be the most Generation X thing imaginable, because underneath all the financial habits, all the skepticism, and all the caution, there is one belief driving almost everything they do. Nobody is coming to rescue you, so you better learn how to survive on your own.